Welcome to the session of VEBA Revolutions, Unleashing the Power of Event-Driven Automation. My name is William Lam. I'm a Senior Staff Solutions Architect at VMware. I focus on our VMware Cloud Services, which is part of our Cloud Infrastructure Business Group. And I'll have Michael introduce himself before we get started.
Hey everyone, Michael Gash, working at VMware and Office of the CTO as a staff engineer. Back to you, William.
Cool, awesome. Okay, I'm sure you guys have all seen this usual disclaimer. There will be a quiz at the very end of the session if you want reading. Let me jump into the quick agenda. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to VEBA. Earlier, we spoke with some folks who may not be familiar with the project, so I'll just give you a quick overview. And then really going to dive right into the meat of the session, which is really showing you how you can quickly go from an idea and to quickly deploying your first function. So we'll really show you for the very first time, how to do this in action from taking source code all the way to deploying a function. And hopefully that'll give you some ideas for some potential use cases for VEBA. And then Michael's going to jump into what's new. We just released our V0.7 release just this morning. So he's going to cover all the brand new capabilities and hopefully ones that you're quite excited for. And then we'll spend some time talking about project futures. And then we're going to close out the session with some call to action, some efforts around the community, and hopefully have a very open and lively discussion on some of the things that we're thinking about, and hopefully to get your engagement. So what is a VMware Event Broker Appliance? It's both for an appliance as well as an application, because this is provided as a solution in two different form factors. And this is a project that Michael and I started back almost close to 4 years now. We released the project back in 2019. And we really had a really simple idea was, could we take some of the modern approaches that we're seeing in the cloud native space and apply some of those learnings and techniques in helping our traditional VI, cloud admin, and IT practitioners, right? And we started with the concept of saying, hey, could we make event-driven using vCenter events really easy? Today, vCenter ships out of the box around 1,800 plus events. In fact, just this past week, we released Vsphere 7.0 Update 3, and it ships out of the box over 1,900 plus events. And the latest VMC release has over 2,000 events. And these are just out of the box. As you add additional second-party solutions like VRA, VROps, and third-party solutions, it actually adds additional events. And so you have a really rich system of things or changes that happens in vCenter. And these things are called events or alarms. Now, alarms is just a very specific type of events that is generally based on metrics. And you've probably seen these. You've seen these notifications that pop up into the vSphere UI. And historically, what you've been able to do is draw out some basic actions from them, right? Send an email, send an SMB trap, or run a command. These aren't the most modern set of actions or automation tasks, but it's been there for quite some time. And we wanted to really see, could we, without modifying vCenter, take these really rich information, like a VM getting created, a VM getting migrated, a failed login, and allow us to easily build event-driven automation that really teaches vCenter to do additional actions without changing the underlying vCenter source code and really enable some broad extensibility use cases. Speaking of use cases, these are some of the 6 that we see most common with both existing VEBA customers as well as users in general. First and foremost, notification is the most popular and the most basic one to get started with, right? A VM goes down. Maybe there are certain VMs that you care about and you don't want them to be powered off. You want to be able to get a notification. This can be Slack, Microsoft Teams, even a text message, or even a physical pager. It's definitely possible with VEBA. Once you're going to go beyond the basic notification use cases, we see customers taking advantage of automation, right? Reacting to things like VM Lifecycle, for example. VM gets created. I want to automatically apply a set of vSphere tags based on the location of the VM, maybe the applications that I need to apply to the system. Maybe it's to react to other things like updating a CMDB or maybe pulling an IP address from your IPAM system. Lots of rich information that can be available from an automation standpoint. Going beyond that further, customers are now integrating with other services. This could be internal IT services, right? It could be your local service desk. It could be external public cloud services like Amazon, Azure, and Google, and taking advantage of these to do end-to-end workflows. After that, remediation is quite popular, especially for SRE and operations background, right? Nobody wants to wake up in the middle of the night to figure out which VMs were impacted because a host went down. We all know that that's the fact of life, but using something like event automation, we can actually pick up on this, vSphere HA event, which gives us a list of those VMs that were impacted And now you can actually take that list of VMs and go do something with it. It could be simply sending an email to each of the application owners. It can be something even more interesting where you go and identify the underlying applications and go do a health test to probe to see if the VM power back on, is the application up and running? And for those set of VMs and applications that did not run, let me go and notify the application owners. So now you're not having to wake up in the middle of the night, and really enables you to scale out your resources and making it easier for IT practitioner. Another really popular use case is around auditing. We've seen the number of CVs that are out there in general, security vulnerabilities. One of the really cool events that come from vCenter is basically a failed login. I don't know how many people know this, but when you do a login to vCenter, whether it's the Vsphere UI or the API or CLI, and it's a failed login, it generates a very specific failed login event. And in that event payload, it actually contains the client IP address that's trying to attempt a login. So imagine if you're getting a bunch of failed logins, you probably want to know about that, right? And it's really difficult today to be able to collect these events, specific events, because what ends up happening is that this lives in the vCenter database. So not only do you have this particular login event, but you have all the other events that exist. And most of that may or may not be useful to you, but you end up having to store that if you want this long-term auditing processes. With something like VEBA, you can selectively pick the events that you care about. Maybe it's a successful login or all logins in general. Maybe anybody that does a delete operation, you want to know about it. Especially from a security and compliance standpoint, you have the ability to multiplex these events, right? I want to be able to send that to my security team, and maybe I want to send that to my admin team for long-term archival purposes. Speaking of archival purposes, there's a lot of interesting analytical use cases you can do now. So just imagine you're able to capture all the VM create events, right? You're now able to look back in history and say, how did this VM change from the initial creation of the VM, right? Kind of the birth of the VM to where it is today, right? Every reconfiguration change of a VM, adding CPU, adding memory, captures a state change, right? And so you can actually replay back the lineage of a VM and say, oh, maybe something broke, maybe somebody took away resources or gave too much resources and I'm wasting it. There's a lot of interesting use cases around just analyzing, the types of workloads and identifying, which set of VMs or configuration are most popular, and you can actually optimize your workflow. We've seen some customers do some really interesting analytics, and ultimately you can store this in an external database. So now you can actually keep vCenter quite small, right? And you don't have to manage it in terms of large capacity. And now you can actually have very specific events that live elsewhere. And the nice thing about all of these use cases is you don't actually need to know how to talk to vCenter as an endpoint. No one understands the APIs, right? It's just identifying that event ID, and now you can actually do some really interesting thing with the event-driven automation. From a persona standpoint, obviously one of our core focus is really helping our VI admins and cloud admins, right? Really be take the existing things that they might be doing manually, the traditional imperative coding, and make it very, very simple for them, right? So that way you can really focus on what we call the business logic, right? Really the value add, right? If you want to get a notification, you don't really care about how does that event come in the system, how to talk to the Vsphere APIs, right? You just want to be able to do the thing that you care about, which is sending a notification. Like I mentioned, SRE operation, very useful for these types of scenarios, especially codifying any of the manual runbooks, right? Now you can actually take those runbooks, turn that into very basic and simple code, which turn into functions, and you can actually deploy that. And now these are automatically reacting to when a storage volume fills up, maybe a VMDK fills up, you can automatically expand the OS based on maybe the persona or the users of that VM. A lot of teams also don't necessarily have to write automation. They have dedicated automation teams, right? And so we see some customers have teams that can now take advantage of something like VEBA as a platform, start to develop all these very useful functions. And now the VI admins, the SREs, and the operations team can actually selectively go and deploy these functions based on particular events, right? So deploying a function is extremely simple, especially with the latest integration into the Vsphere UI. And we'll demo that in a little bit, and you can see how that can be used. And then lastly, lots of huge opportunity in the VMware third-party ecosystem. Imagine security backup vendors. Now they can actually react to a VM event. When a VM gets created, I automatically apply a backup and a security policy without you ever thinking about it, right? So once you've set up that policy, maybe you're reacting to the VM gets created. Maybe you react to specific Vsphere tags that get assigned to a VM. Lots of possibilities, and we've seen really interesting use cases that have come up from our third-party ecosystem. I'm going to hand it over to Michael to talk a little bit about how some of our customers are using and just hear from them on some of the use cases that he's seeing.
Thanks, William. You know, it's probably easy for William and myself because we are biased to try to convince you about using VEBA and follow this event-driven approach. So instead of doing this, we asked one of our core community leads in the VEBA project, Scott Rosenberg, who's also on the show today. Hey, Scott, to give a little bit of feedback and how he's using and how VEBA is benefiting him in his daily life. So he says VEBA has allowed us to spend our time on what really matters and not on repetitive tasks. Getting started with VEBA is really easy and adds huge value to almost every environment. And this is certainly true. And one of the key use cases why we build VEBA is freeing you from dealing with all these lower-level plumbing APIs that you would have to use and set up and learn versus literally getting your task done. So let's take a quick look into how Scott is using VEBA in his daily job at TerraSky. So Scott was kind enough to share a couple of use cases, and he had shared 100 or more than 100 function ideas with us. So we grouped them and condensed them in this list here. And one of the key use cases he's using is setting DRS anti-affinity rules based on events from the Vsphere infrastructure to align the TKGM clusters, Tensor Kubernetes grid clusters, so that the Kubernetes nodes are on the actual correct fault domain or DRS group, so that Kubernetes as one scheduler and Vsphere on the other hand as another scheduler are not getting in conflict when it comes to these decisions. And so he's trapping into these events and VMs are migrating and either reconciling or at least alerting on misaligned affinity rules. Another one is tag management, where new VMs being created or hosts added to the clusters and data stores, tags can be applied or even removed depending on the actual operation. So this is nice for auditing, but also billing purposes and other kind of management concerns. Saving the planet, saving the energy. One of the key use cases he also has is shutting down of lab VMs over the weekend. And this can easily be done through a cron job that we have in VEBA or other cases as well. But literally, it's just a ping that you get every, say, Sunday or every hour, where your function wakes up and then does something. In this case, it's probing off VMs that are not production. Slack notifications, William already touched on this one when issues arise. Host remediation via IPMI when hosts are not responding. This is also cool because you get notified there and then you can perform actions on the IPMI, for example, reset the host or reboot the host if needed. DNS management for VMs through the VM lifecycle. So when VMs again get created or updated or kind of terminated, you can update, or Scott is updating the DNS database for these kind of IP assignments and DNS names as well. And then a couple of VRA related operations. I'm sure Chad is also happy to hear them here. So as VMs are onboarded to vRealize, doing something like in Vsphere or performing additional operations there. And I think all in all, these are really great use cases and examples from Scott as he's using it. And you don't have to go that fancy like Scott is because he's really, really smart and talented. It's literally an easy one to get started just with the Slack notification and then work you through this new approach of using events as the way to drive your infrastructure. So for this edition of the VEBA talk at VMworld, we thought we'll spend more time on how you can get started writing a function. So in the previous meetings that we did on VEBA, we were more around the appliance itself. But here in this talk, we want to spend more time on the actual experience, how you write a function. And so let me quickly give you an introduction of the anatomy, if you will, of a VEBA function before William will give you a detailed walkthrough of how to build and deploy your first function. So even though not strictly required, the Docker file is usually used by VEBA functions to describe the container contract, if you will. Docker is not strictly a requirement, but most of the functions that we provide and that you will likely use Docker as the container implementation. And so the Docker file there is the implementation of how you describe what goes in the function. Now, you don't really have to know about this because essentially you can use our ready-to-build function examples and build off them, because we have built templates for Python, PowerShell, PowerCLI, obviously, and other languages as needed. The next one is secrets and configuration-related data, because it's good practice to keep configuration or dynamic content outside of your actual functional logic. And so we have the concept of secret in VEBA, which uses the secrets concept in Kubernetes, if you're familiar with that, to inject configuration or credentials like vCenter credentials or Slack tokens and so on. And they will be bound dynamically through your lifetime of your function when you deploy. And last one, which is most important, this is basically where you are, which is the handler, the function logic. And the handler is literally the thing that gets called when a new event is ingested or sent to your function and when your function is invoked. There's most stuff that happens behind the scenes. So there's, for PowerShell, for example, an HTTP server that we provide and run for you, and error handling and all the stuff. But this is all noise that you don't have to know about. You only have to know about the handler, and the handler is where your business logic, your code basically goes. So William has prepared a demo, which is for this purpose here, the Slack notification. So imagine the case or the use case where you have a VM that is notified to Slack. Oh, I'm clicking, but you want to get notified to Slack when this VM, like critical VMs. This is the demo that William has prepared, and we'll go walk you through slowly how to build your function in this case.
I think maybe you might have been breaking up a little bit, Michael. So maybe I'll just.
I'm sorry.
Yep. Yeah. So the use case here we'll cover, and this is a really basic one, and you'll see how you can take this example and apply this to almost any of the events and examples that we had talked about, right? So we've got this VM that's powered on. When it powers off, it's going to generate a powered off event, right? And there's a GitHub page that actually lists all the different events that are available to you. And I even have a script that will give you specific events for your vCenter server, because like I mentioned earlier, each vCenter really is unique based on how you've deployed it. And that generates an event. That event's going to call into one of our PowerShell function, and its job is to basically send a Slack message. Really, really basic, right? And I'll show you how that works in this demo. Okay, so let's see. So in the example, I have my VM. We got this VMworld 2020 VM. And one of the first thing I want to do is I want to be able to capture, I want to be able to capture the specific event that's related to the powered off, right? That's the very first question, right? You might ask is like, well, how do I capture that? We have this really cool tool called Sockeye that allows us to quickly view the different events that are streaming in from your vCenter server into VEBA. So it's always listening, right? And so one of the really cool things is that once I do the power off, it's actually going to refresh and lie in real time. So when you actually deploy, let's see. When you actually deploy VEBA for the first time, it's constantly listening. And you can see in this example here, there you go. When it powers off the VM, it's going to generate that event. And now you're able to basically capture what that event looks like. And that's really the first task as you think about writing your first function, right? Is understanding what does that payload actually look like. So now I can search for it. And here we found the event, right? And here there's some information about it, right? We can see that this is coming from a very specific vCenter server. So if you have multiple vCenter servers, you'll be able to see those entries here. I can see the event is called VM powered off event. Pretty straightforward, right? But there may be some that's not as straightforward. You can see that this is coming from a 7.0 U2 environment. And then on the right-hand side, you can see what the event looks like. Now, for anybody that's familiar with the Vsphere eventing API, this might look really, really familiar. And what we've done is taken that information, transformed it into what we call the cloud event. It's a industry standard, allows us to then consume it. This is now forwarded to VEBA for consumption. Now, from a function development standpoint, this is really nice because once I've identified the event and grabbed an example, and in this example here, I've powered off a VM called VM 2021, and this is all the information that's replayed into that event. I no longer need to think about VEBA and all these different things. I can actually do all my development locally. So one of the things that we'll do is we'll take a look at an example function that normally where most people will start. So we'll go ahead and open up our Slack PowerShell function. And inside this directory, there is a test directory. And the really nice thing about the latest version of VEBA is that you can actually do all your function development locally. You don't need a vSphere environment. You don't even need VEBA deployed, right? Like we mentioned earlier, you're going to spend most of your time in this thing called a handler. That is basically the business logic, right? At no point do you need to know how to log into vSphere, how to use the APIs. You've gotten the payload. And so what we've done here from a local development standpoint is that you can take that event, right, and paste that into this file. And this will allow you to actually mimic a powered off event. That way you can do your own local development testing. And that way you can write it in any language, whether it's Python, PowerShell, Ruby, any language of your choice. And then there are two there's a shell script and a PowerShell script in these examples that will basically, reference this payload, which is this powered off event, right? And then send that payload and basically mimicking this event itself. So we've done all that for each of these examples. And so this is how you kind of get started. So I won't spend too much time go into the details here. So we'll go ahead and fast forward, and then we're going to jump into the handler. So in the handler for the PowerShell, there's kind of like three pieces of the function. There is an init function, and what that is responsible for is for running any type of code that you want to do at the start. A good example is like using PowerCLI, right? If you were to react to an event that performs like, say, a tagging operation, you would have to log in, take some amount of time to initialize, and then you go apply a Vsphere tag. If you have a bunch of these events coming, you probably don't want to do these logins and logouts each and every single time. So one of the nice things that we built into this handler is that we have this init and shutdown process where we're able to basically log into the desired endpoint. In this case, if I want to do something with vCenter, I could actually do a login, and it now keeps a connection that's warm and hot for me. So that way, when the events comes in and I want to perform, say, a PowerCLI specific operation or any operation that uses an API endpoint, I can immediately do that. Since this example, we're just sending Slack messages, we actually don't need any code in the init and shutdown, but these are kind of generic handlers that's there for you to process. And then obviously for the shutdown, right, I want to be able to disconnect my PowerCLI session if my function is getting undeployed or if it crashes for whatever reason. Now, the meat of the example is really this process handling. This is where you're going to spend most of your time. And you can see in this function here, there's no PowerCLI code, there's no API code of how to talk to vCenter. You've already gotten this event and it's encoded in this variable called cloud event, right? And when we mimic this locally, this will be that test payload that I showed off earlier. And all we're doing here is basically decoding that event and taking out the data payload, right? So this is that construct of the event itself. And now we can actually look into the details. Here we have an environmental variable called Slack secret because we're going to send a message to Slack. That is going to be encoded in a webhook URL, and I probably don't want to hardcode that in my function. So now I'm actually reading that from the secret that we deployed earlier, and I'll show you what that looks like when we actually go deploy this function. And now I have access to those secrets, right? And so these could be, credentials. They can be dynamic variables that come in, especially for testing purposes. And then here I have some debugging code that says, hey, if I have this function, if I have this variable toggle for debugging, go print some statements. And the rest of this code really is the logic to send a Slack message. Here I'm constructing a payload on how I want the Slack message to look like. Maybe I want some emojis in there. And I'm able to take out variables. And you should notice that these variables reflect back to that payload that we had sent in earlier, right? So once you understand what is that powered off event payload, I can now extract specific fields. And these are just JSON payloads. So using any language, whether it's Ruby, Python, PowerShell, you can easily interact with it, right? And really the magic is really on line 78, right? If you didn't get anything out of this particular handler section, it's really this last line, right? Which is, here's this message. I fill in the name of the VM, the user who powered it off, and then time that this event happened. And then I'm just going to send a Slack function. Pretty straightforward, right? There's no Vsphere code in here at all. And that's purposely by design, right? And so again, if you can write that minimum amount of code to do that action, you're like 99.9% done. So now that we have all of our code and we've verified this locally, syntactically it looks fine, we're now going to actually go and do some testing. So here we have a Slack secret JSON. This is basically where we're going to encode our secret when we go and deploy this to VEBA. For local testing, we're going to go ahead and use this Docker file. And basically, it's just a file that holds a number of secrets, right? So here we're going to go ahead and encode the Slack secret. Don't worry, the Slack secret has already been invalidated for those that's interested in sending a message, right? But once we've done that, we've got all the bases that we need now. The next step is to basically build our container image. What this does is it's going to take that function that we just wrote that sends a message to Slack and containerizes, right? So you can actually run this function here to go and do the deployment locally. And then we're also going to test it locally to make sure that everything works perfectly fine before we even go do the deployment. So here we can see the same structure there, and we've got our Docker file. And like Michael mentioned earlier, you don't really need to know about Docker, but it is good to kind of understand the basis of it. Is here we're using the base image that we produce for you, and this is our base PowerShell container image. You have your handler.ps1 file. That is basically what we just wrote, and then it's going to start the server. Right? You'll notice that all the Docker files look roughly the same, right? Really what you're changing is the handler.ps1 file. So now we're going to go and do a Docker build, and this basically builds our container image, and you give it a name, and it's basically a local container that runs on your computer. And this should take about a couple of minutes or so. Once it's done, we're now ready to test this locally before we actually go do the deployment. So the really nice thing about this is that you can do all your validation, try out the function and see if it's doing what you're doing exactly, right? And so if you follow the README for this function, we can now run this function locally on the system. And once it's running, you'll see all the startup print messages from the different function that's going on, right? And it's basically running this on port 8080, our brand new container image. So it started up, you can see it's ran the init. Because we're not doing anything in the init or shutdown, you won't see that information there. Now, if we go into our test directory, again, as I mentioned earlier, we had that test script, right? So that test script is going to basically send a cloud event using the payload that we had just sent. So you can see here, I'm locally mimicking that experience. And now the function, decodes these secrets, right? I do some printing so we can see that event that's been produced, which is that powered off event. I can see that my code is doing exactly the right thing. It's taking the information such as the name of the VM, the user who created the event and the time, and it went and sent a message. So if this worked correctly, I should be able to now open up my Slack channel. You can see it's already verified, right? So now you can see it just sent a message to my Slack instance and it shows me the information. So now we're ready to actually go and deploy this to VEBA. So what we want to do is push our container image that we just built to some registry. Now this doesn't have to be like Docker Hub or Harbor. It can also be an internal registry. It just needs to be something that VEBA can actually consume. So now we have our Slack channel. It's empty, as you can see. Our VM is still powered on. I'm not going to take you through the function deployment. In the Vsphere UI, we actually have a really nice integration with VEBA where you can actually easily deploy your function. The first thing I'm going to walk you through is basically deploying the secret. So instead of using the CLI, you can actually use the UI. So here we're going to create a secret. This is our Slack secret. Ultimately, you as a function author defines what are the secrets and what are the requirements. And in this function, I get to define this variable called Slack_webhook URL, and I put in the value, right? And the nice thing about this is that these secrets can then be reused for other functions. Now I'm going to go in and search for my event. Like I mentioned earlier, it's really it can be challenging to basically search for different events. Let me just back up that just for a second. It can be really difficult to search for different events in your environment. The really cool thing about this is that with this integration, you can now use the Vsphere UI and search for the event that you're interested in. And just by simply typing a couple of words, it's actually identifying out of the 2,000 plus events that are available or more, the event that I'm interested in. So here I'm interested in the powered off event, and I can see that it's already found it for me. So now I'm going to go ahead and click on the deploy option. And here we're going to give it the name of the function. And then we're going to point to that Docker image. This is the thing that we had just built. So I pushed this onto Docker Hub. So that's the image that I'm going to reference here. We have the ability to control some additional settings. We're going to ignore that. We can also do environmental variables, but here we're going to go ahead and select our secrets. And this is the secret that we had just specified earlier. And we go ahead and go through the deployment. Now we can also click onto the functions tab. This will show you all the different functions that are deployed. And this is really cool because now you get a single view of all the different functions you've got deployed, the different events that it's reacting to, the container image that it's running. And if I wanted to add an additional event, let's say I want to get a notification anytime VMs get powered on or off, I just need to select that function and go ahead and add an additional event. It's the same workflow. I go in and search for the particular event, and I can actually chain multiple events to a particular function, or I can do multiple function deployments depending on your particular use case. So let me just play this again. So we've gone and deployed it. We can see that the status is true, and we can see our Slack instance is empty. So now we've deployed it to VEBA, and what we expect now is if I power off that VM, I should get that message deployed using the code that we had just wrote. So I go and power off the VM. State is now done, and you can see immediately it sent the code. So you can see from creating the code locally, grabbing the event and testing it locally to verify that everything works, we can now deploy this function in a very consistent and reliable fashion. And this is one of the benefits of being able to do development locally that makes it really super easy. So with that, I want to just pause for a second and see if there was any questions or things that we can clarify before we continue on. I
did that in the chat, William, already.
Fantastic.
Good questions. Yeah, good questions there, okay. And use cases.
All right, well, so with that, let's take a look at some of the net new functionality that's available in the upcoming release, and I'll hand that back over to Michael.
Thanks, William. And I'll keep my camera off just to make sure that I'm not breaking up. Sorry for that. So, I mean, just one more note, because I always have like a big smile on my face when I see these demos. It's literally so easy to get started with this stuff, because you don't have to deal with like all the security stuff, the resource management, and the networking, all the connection handling, and all the stuff, and the SDKs and what have you, right? You literally, hey, here's an event, do something with it. And that's really great. And that's, I think, one of the powers that VEBA brings. Okay, so luckily today we had our next release of VEBA, which is the 07 release. And as William wrote in a blog post, this is the biggest release that we've ever done. And this is truly only possible through the big community support that we've received over the years. So let's dive in. First one, and this is from Robert Guske. He is also working at VMware and like long-term Viva contributor. He added cAdvisor support in Viva. Now, what does it mean for you? So in Viva, we have different endpoints to the Viva URL. So when you go to your browser, you had different interfaces like admin interfaces and stats and retrieving metrics and so on. And Robert added another one, which is /top. And /top gives you information about the actual container usage in Viva. Like we run different containers, so you can drill into the CPU and memory resource usage of these containers. And that's really nice because it gives you much more detailed and fine-grained information for the container usage, which in Viva for core containers, but also for the functions which are made of containers. But another benefit is that because we're using cAdvisor here, this can also be integrated into VROPs. So Robert also built a dashboard, custom dashboard that gives you all this information in a rolled up fashion into VROPs. And this is just possible by the work that he's done here with cAdvisor. So thanks again, Robert, big kudos. Okay, so we'll continue with Robert. He was on a roll there. He also added a logging support, like external syslog support. And the main use case here was integrating in something like vRealize Log Insight or Log Intelligence. So in Viva, when you deploy the appliance, there's a couple of new steps that you can optionally perform, which is defining the remote syslog system. So you specify host name or address, you specify the port. We have different transport protocols to support like basically the protocols that Log Insight and others offer, and then also the format. And what you get there is then the logs that are produced by the Viva containers, like the routers, like the core components, but also by the functions. There's still a little kind of bug that we are chasing down, which is caused by some of the components we are using here, and we are resolving that with the community. But the end goal, net result, is that all of the logs that are produced by your functions, like the output that you saw by William in his demo, like send something to Slack, for example, that this can be then forwarded to syslog or Log Intelligence, and you can like query and search and do advanced queries there as needed and troubleshooting. And we'll stay with the Log Insight topic here a little bit, but zooming out, we also added webhook support. Now, if you're not familiar with what webhooks are, it's literally nothing but an HTTP server that we also additionally spin up in Viva, and that listens for a specific kind of incoming HTTP messages or packets, if you will. And so if you are about to send an event from outside, from any system that can create or construct a cloud event, which is the standard industry standard that we are using in Viva, you can easily ingest that into Viva. And so the use case behind that was to unlock Viva for more use cases and systems, like even external, like non-VMware products that can construct these cloud events and then ingest into Viva. So we're opening this up like to a completely new like audience and also product landscape. And the best thing here is that there's no code change required in your function, because at the end of the day, you will get cloud events, which is the standard that we are using. And then so if you happen to have a function, you only have to change maybe the trigger, that it's now not just triggering off by a Vsphere event, but maybe also by an Azure or AWS event. So what are the integrations that then can easily be unlocked here? So VMware Cloud Notification Gateway, like SCDC events, for example, can be now sent via this webhook support. Log Intelligence that we just talked about earlier in the syslog section, but also vRealize operations. They all have support for webhooks, like sending stuff to an external webhook system. And then Viva becomes this exact webhook endpoint. So you can construct rules and alerts in VROPs and Log Intelligence, and then to forward into Viva to maybe aggregate or do some correlations there, or forward to another system like your Slack, for example. So you don't have to write this logic in these different systems, but you only write your function once, and then we'll send Vsphere events, VROPs events, Log Intelligence events, and so on to Slack. And then last but not least, all the major clouds and also service providers, many of them support external webhooks like AWS Event Bridge, for example, or Azure Event Grid, and so on. So rest assured, there's probably in your environment a system that can construct a webhook and a cloud event payload, and so you can easily ingest that into Viva. I'm super excited about this feature. And the last one is Horizon support. So this was also a very common request by our community to support Horizon server, like VDI deployments. And so we added support to easily tap into the recently added Horizon Events API by some configuration options also in the VEBA, during the VEBA deployment. And Horizon offers more than 850 plus events out of the box, and you'll see that in a minute in a demo from William. But just quickly covering the customization section here, the interesting thing is that, yes, you can specify all the Horizon details, username, password, and so on. But the nice thing is that the configuration allows you to not only just have Horizon for this appliance, but also Vsphere and also Webhook. So that's also a benefit that we added. It's not just you need to spin up one appliance per, say, Horizon, but you can also combine them. Like you can have one appliance that covers Horizon, Webhook, and VEBA, or you can distribute them as needed if you want to scale, for example. So I'm really excited about this functionality as well. And let's pray for the demo gods and give it back to William to give you a quick demo.
Cool. Thanks for that, Michael. Yeah, super excited about the webhook and the Horizon functionality. In fact, like Michael mentioned, there's a lot of demand for Horizon and different sets of use cases, right? Just by simply adding this, you now have over 850 events. You know, here's a particular interesting one when I speak with some of our EUC colleagues at VMware. You know, today the Horizon admin portal, it's not really protected by something like two-factor authentication. And so there could be challenges where, you know, somebody might try to log in, you know, with nefarious means and all that. And one of the cool things with Horizon is that we actually can track a failed login. And so imagine somebody trying to log into your admin portal, you probably want to know about it right away. So again, we're using the canonical Slack example. I was able to easily adapt the Vsphere example that sent a powered off event to Slack, literally with one line change, basically replacing a Vsphere event ID with a Horizon event ID. I now have this example. So let's take a look at what this example looks like. So here I'm going to become a bad actor, and I'm going to go in and try to log into this Horizon instance, right? And as it processes, Horizon is going to say, hey, that's a bad username and password, and basically fail the authentication. And behind the scene, that generates a Horizon event. This is something that you can actually see in the Horizon login UI. And you can see immediately, right? Once it failed, you immediately got that. This was in real time. There's no magic of editing of the video. And here we can see, you know, where it came from, the specific Horizon server, the username and that attempted this operation, and also the time. Now, if I were logging as an admin within the Horizon server, you can see these exact same events are actually available in your Horizon portal. But instead of just being able to search for it and have to look up this events over systems, you can actually have real-time notification. You can have auditing, compliance, all the use cases we talked about. You can now apply this to Horizon. And again, using that sockeye interface, we can actually easily figure out which of the events that are happening in real time for development purposes, right? And so if I wanted to see what that message looks like for a Horizon event versus a Vsphere event versus some other webhook event that you might ingest into the system, the sockeye interface is extremely helpful to show you what that payload looks like. You can do the exact same thing as I mentioned earlier. You copy this payload into a test directory, and now you can do your development. So let's say you're not interested in Slack, you want to use something like Microsoft Teams. We had another customer recently do a VM migration using Telegram, right? So lots of really interesting, cool use cases, very basic from a notification standpoint. But once you understand that, you can start to expand the sets of use cases. And with these new providers like Horizon and Webhook, we really give you a bunch of functionality that's going to be available at your disposal. So definitely excited to see what customers are going to do with that. Now, we've had VEBA around for about 3 years now. Lots of great participation, and a lot of the roadmap and the features have really been because of our end users. And one thing that we've literally heard consistently, even from day one, when we first introduced VEBA back in 2019 at VMworld, you know, this was done in person, you know, we hear a lot about, well, how do I get support? How do I buy this? Can I get a commercial offering? Like, you know, and it's a fantastic thing to hear. And we didn't really have a good answer for you. But at this VMworld, we're really excited to share some really exciting updates for the team, and hopefully you're excited about it just like we are. Now, one of the things that we actually released earlier this year, coming from our VMware Tanzu team, is something called Cloud Native Runtime. This is really a commercial offering of the Knative technology that we're currently using for VEBA. And it basically allows you to have both a runtime for building application as well as functional programming. It's actually two components when you think of Knative. There's a serving component for building application services, and then there's an eventing component. And I'll come back to this in a second. But CNR is generally available, got announced earlier this, I think a couple months back, and it easily integrates with various Tanzu integrations. So things like Tanzu observability, some of our build services, right? As you think about building your end-to-end code pipelines, it is Kubernetes underneath the hood. And so this can run on our, obviously on our TKG grid cluster, as well as any public cloud that supports Kubernetes. And then from a deployment model, you can either deploy this, download the deliverables, or you can actually deploy this through Tanzu Mission Control. So this is something that's generally available. Now, why do I bring this up? Now, as I mentioned earlier, CNR is our commercial offering from VMware for Knative. And as part of Knative, there's two packages to it. The serving component has already officially GA and fully supported by VMware. The eventing package is part of CNR. However, it's still currently in beta process, but it is going to be coming out of GA hopefully within Q3 of 2021. Now, why is this important? Well, the eventing comes with a number of event sources. One popular one is trigger mesh sources for AWS. This allows us to easily bring in events coming from AWS like S3, SNS, SQS, even CloudWatch. So just like you can get events for your on-premises infrastructure, you might see events coming from the public cloud services, right? And you may want to do something very interesting with those things. Now, one of the really interesting event sources that's available as part of CNR is this thing called sources for Vsphere. This sounds quite interesting. And as we've been developing VEBA, one of our efforts is really making this really easily available for our customers, right, for official enterprise support. And so what Michael has been working on for the past year is actually taking the heart of VEBA, which is this thing called the VMware Event Router. And we've actually been porting that code over into sources for Vsphere. And we made a lot of great progress. And so now the heart of VEBA and the functionality that VEBA is delivered today as a virtual appliance and as a Fling is actually part of sources for Vsphere. So this is our way of bringing a commercial offering for customers who want the additional support and being able to phone for GSS. Now, on top of the commercial offering, obviously you're interested around support and sort of how do I obtain this? The really cool thing is that you can actually obtain this today using one of two offerings, either through our Tanzu Advanced SKU, and this includes a number of functionality, not only the Knative or CNR runtime, but we also have a Kubernetes runtime. So for customers who do not have a Kubernetes offering, or maybe they're using open source Kubernetes and they want something that they can phone in for enterprise support, we do have our enterprise grade Tanzu Kubernetes Grid runtime. And it also includes a number of other capabilities, but CNR is also included in Tanzu Advanced. If you're already using Kubernetes and maybe you want to have something that's very optimum for a Kubernetes-based infrastructure, we do have another package called the Tanzu Application Platform. So these are all the different things bundled together to be able to deploy efficiently to a Kubernetes endpoint. And the nice thing about that is CNR is also included for TAP as well. So we're really excited to announce this news. As eventing becomes generally available, hopefully soon we'll definitely share the big news. But for anybody that's been asking like, hey, can I get support for this? Can I buy this? The answer is absolutely yes. If you're interested to learn more, definitely reach out to your VMware account team. And they'll definitely connect you with the right set of folks. But we're super excited that we're now able to actually bring and productize VEBA and bring this to our customers, as part of the cloud native runtime. And you'll definitely see a lot more innovations happening in this space. But again, we want to ensure you that myself and Michael's commitment, our team's commitment to open source, we will continue to develop in the open and actually share with you all the different ideas. And a lot of this is really driven by you as a customer. So we're hoping you'll have some discussions with us as we talk about a little bit about the futures. Michael, over to you.
Yeah, awesome. And before we wrap it up, just a quick note on what William just said. So VEBA is this kind of exploration tool that we have with the community where we explore these ideas like Horizon support, websocket support, and so on. And then as we get our feedback from you as the community, we basically then port and use this code into our products like Tensor application platform, for example. And William, this was also one question asked in the Slack channel. I'm sorry, in the chat here. And then there were also questions around support for Microsoft Teams as an example, and so on. So yes, we have that. And William, you built it, right? And we have more examples to come as well.
Yep, yeah, we got Microsoft Teams. There's tons of examples. And so those, as long as you can write that code to send to Teams, you've already done it, right? And there's a lot of examples that we've included in this upcoming releases. So we highly recommend you check out the website. There's a bunch of resources that we'll talk about in a little bit. So if you hold some of those questions, we'll get to that in a second.
Yes, and there's also our Slack channel. We'll share the details at the end of the session where you can come and chat and explore ideas. Okay, so last section is talking project futures. And we didn't call it roadmap because technically VEBA doesn't really have a roadmap. It's literally ideas that we have and we want to share and get your feedback on. So I'm going to go through the individual ideas or topics that we have in mind for some of the next releases. And feel free to just drop like a note or a number in chat so we know which one are you preferring or most interested in. So the first one, you saw this in the demo example that William gave for building a function, but there's still a little bit too much CLI tooling involved for building or even bootstrapping a function, if you ask me. So we are, together with the Knative community, we are working on a CLI tool, which is called KNFunc, which lets you easily create a template like a skeleton of a function for any of the programming languages you are interested in. And it lets you build and run and deploy and test and so on easily with one command line tool instead of switching between Git and Docker and other script invocations. So this is kind of top of mind for us because the VEBA like basically comes and falls with the experience, like your first experience of writing a function. And so we want to make that smooth as possible. Second one is, do you want more processors and providers? Probably the answer is yes. The question is just which one, right? So we, with the added support for Horizon and Webhook, we crossed off, I think, a lot of the requests that we have seen for ingesting events into VEBA. But maybe you're also thinking about dedicated processors, like the stuff that then is done at the, like as an output of VEBA. Think of Slack, for example, as a function. So maybe there are patterns or ideas that you have where you think, okay, it would be nice to have this as a standard processor instead of reinventing the wheel. And I see, yes, NSXT, Scott, we're working on this one. Next one is easing the migrations between VEBA and cloud native runtime or the Tensor portfolio in general. So this is what William just touched on previously with the commercial aspect. So we want to make sure that if you deploy and write your functions on VEBA, that it's literally just a copy and paste into one of the Tensor products if you want to get a fully supported platform. Now, today, there are some minor differences in the cloud event envelope. The schema that we use there, for example, the type and the subject is a little bit different. So it's not a big deal to change that for you if you want to deploy it, but still it's kind of a small change that you have to do. And we're working on harmonizing these kind of small differences between the product and the open source Fling so that you literally can just redeploy your function and off you go without any changes. Next one is improving resiliency and scalability. And this has come from a couple of VEBA users who've been using it for a while now, especially around message handling, throughput, and failover like availability concerns. So this is more like backend work that we have to do. And we already had fixed one of this in RabbitMQ in the throughput that I think Aaron Meyer has been asking for because he saw like a huge growing backlog of events in VEBA, which weren't like processed as fast as possible. And so this is a fix that we are working on incorporating in the next release of VEBA. But there's other stuff that you might have concerns around. So we are happy to hear about them. Another one also backend related is internal refactoring, like updating versions for Kubernetes, Knative used, and so on. This probably not so much of importance for you as a user, but maybe you run VEBA in a Kubernetes environment and you want to see there some improvements or versions we don't support. So let us know. And then we also are like for the 07 release, we already deprecated in the appliance deployment mode the support for OpenFaaS and AWS Event Bridge. Deprecation means it's still available there. You can still use it, but it will be removed in the next version. So we're doubling down basically and continue to use Knative because it gives us all the primitives and requirements that we have. Now, because VEBA not only consists of this appliance, but at the core, there's this event router. The event router still, like if you just pull it from Docker, it still supports OpenFaaS and AWS Event Bridge. So in one of the next releases, we'll also deprecate it in there. So if you only use the container and not the appliance, this might also affect you. And so let us know if there's issues with that. And last but not least, I think this is improving appliance deployment and lifecycle management, meaning right now, if there's a new VEBA version, you have to completely redeploy the appliance and also your functions and so on. And it's a fling. So has not so much been of a focus around lifecycle management because we had other features and priorities that you wanted. But I think this is also an area that we need to improve on and love to get your feedback. And we also have Vladimir Velikov from the vCenter UI engineering team on the call, who's been very helpful over the years in like adding the UI, for example, for VEBA. And so he'd be happy to brainstorm and jump on a call with you. All right, so let's just build this out. There's one thing that we also wanted to shout out here is we'll call this an Ask Me Anything at the end of October, but what it really is a monthly call, a VEBA call, where we will be there, like the VEBA community will be there. And you can come and just join and ask questions or show a function, or if you have trouble and issues, go through and debug something. Obviously, if there's a lot of people in there, we need to prioritize a little bit. But we are planning to have these open community calls every last Tuesday in the month at 8 p.m. Pacific. And the link is there for the Zoom invitation. And I think we also have a little bit more details here at the end of how to reach out and contact us on Slack, on Twitter, Web, or email if you're more classic into it. So
if I
you
just
go.
go back a couple of slides. And in this session, really what we found, as we engage with the community, and thank you to all that's been sharing what you've learned and even contributing back to the project, is we want to expand this and make this even broader. So you have ideas for question, maybe you're not unsure what a particular event in vCenter might look like. Maybe you have an idea for a use case, but you just don't know how to get started. Bring it here. There's a lot of great contribution and collaborations across the community, folks, and all that. And we want to have this as a recurring event. And so if there's something that you're thinking about that we haven't thought about, or you've just done something really cool, we'd love for you to bring in and share it. Scott's been doing some really amazing things, and he's been really helpful in sharing some of his stories with other customers. And so if you'd like to do the same thing, definitely just sign up for this event. It's free. You can just listen in, or you can also participate. I know that we have a little bit more time. And I did want to kind of go back to the topics of just general kind of Q&A, if there's any kind of questions that you might have, or anything that were covered. We'd love this kind of open-ended time for the audience right now, if you have any questions or comments.
There's just one I want to take from the chat. So we got all the the processors support. That's great. But there's one question, the backend work ++ from Dave. And he said he would have an easier job getting this into production if we had better assurances we wouldn't risk dropping events. And this certainly has been an issue in older versions of VEBA, because we weren't really guaranteeing message delivery or event delivery. But we have improved this over time, and especially in the product, in the Tensor application portfolio like tab, where we are trying to have these at least once guarantees, meaning your function will be at least invoked once or multiple times for the same event, because we retry under covers and we have persistency in the message broker. So this has been really improved, also available in the appliance itself, but also in the product. And we keep improving that. So Dave, if there's a specific need or ask you have, drop me a note and we'll get it up.
No, that was a great question. Thanks, Dave.
Yep.
Any other questions that maybe we haven't answered? Or folks, feel free to just unmute yourself. This is really your time. I think we have like maybe five minutes or so. So we're here to help answer any questions, give me the questions or comments you may have.
So Dion had a question on the Ask Me Anything link. I'm just asking if you got it for the Zoom invite.
This one?
Yes.
And that URL will be a stable URL, actually. So as we have these monthly events that happen at the end of October every Tuesday, once the next one rolls up, you can continue using the same URL. We will just update the Zoom invite on the back end. These sessions will be recorded and they'll have notes. And so if you aren't able to attend, you can definitely catch the recording. And we certainly invite folks to check it out and participate.
Yes, so Scott had a question. The slides will be shared through the code team. And then there was a question from Sean. Is the project part of the Hacktoberfest effort? Is the question here like whether you can use VEBA and then hack, or hack VEBA? I don't know what the question is asked, Sean.
Oh, Hacktoberfest encourages people to join open source projects and help out with them. So it's a great way to get contributors, especially first-time open source contributors, to fix issues in your project.
That's a good idea, Sean. And I'll take a note for this and discuss this in this VEBA community call. Because we are not really yet structured about like first issue or something like that, but we'll obviously welcome more contributors. So that's a good idea. It's 8 a.m. Sydney. Oh, sorry.
I had a question, if you guys don't mind.
Yeah,
Sure.
Kyle here. I've occasionally poked into you guys' Slack channels. You may have seen my name before, but I had a question. If we wanted to, let's say, might be something you guys do already, maybe not. But let's say that you guys had a VEBA API per se that we wanted to use to potentially log events to from some other source that's not Vsphere to or is not the vCenter. Is that a possibility?
Absolutely. In fact, that's the whole benefit of the webhook. It's not necessarily an API, so VEBA already accepts it. So if you turn on the webhook functionality, it's basically going to be listening for a payload, and you can basically put basic authorization on that. And like Michael said, if you can construct that event, right, which is just HTTP, so you can either do it in binary or structured mode, right? And so it just has a couple of headers, and then you give it a body, an arbitrary body of data, right? And so this will allow you for VEBA to ingest any event as long as it's a cloud event, right? And that'll come right into the appliance, and then now becomes an event that can then be subscribed by other functions. And so absolutely, and that really allows us to ingest other events as one mechanism. Now, if you have a system that cannot construct a cloud event, maybe it can only send a very specific payload. Another way of achieving this is you can actually build a function in VEBA, right? And one of the nice things about Knative is that, remember earlier, there's a serving and eventing component. Every function is actually available and served as an ingress endpoint. And so now you can actually create a custom function that understands this very specific payload. You can then consume that as just like a regular HTTP API call. And then your function can be responsible for re-transforming that data from a non-cloud event to a cloud event for that to VEBA router. So it's kind of doing a local loop back. And now you have custom events in VEBA. So yeah, absolutely, you can definitely do that, Kyle.
Thank you.
Yep. And I even have a blog post on both of these topics, which I blogged about maybe a couple of weeks back. And so if you search for VEBA on my blog, you'll see some specific examples of how this can be accomplished. But that's a great way for you to actually extend to other events in the system. Great question. We have
we still got time. I'm looking through the chat, William. I think I got most of this.
Okay.
Just a framing thing. I used to work last week for the Tanzu Labs professional services team. And the way we framed this with a lot of customers was event-driven operations, right? And to move your organization into that mode, you need a tool like this to do that.
That's a great point, Sean. Yeah, I mean, SRE in operation is definitely a big key one that we see. Certainly isn't the only primary use case, but we definitely see a lot of interest in that space just because a lot of this becomes reactive. And sometimes the reaction can be either manual, which becomes really challenging to scale yourself out. But even if you wrote some automation, somebody still needs to run it. And in traditional imperative code, something could go wrong, right? And in a model like this, you don't need to know or even have access, right? So if you have an SRE team, you can actually set this up with a read-only role, which is the only thing that's required, and you get the event and you do something with that. So I love that idea, right? Is turning this into an event driven for operations purposes.
Another great question from Andy. Starting from zero, like not completely new to the concept and whole stuff. We have a great series by Patrick Kramer. He's also another great first-time contributor from day on. And Patrick not only shares his experience of like, hey, I have no clue what Git and Docker is, to, hey, I just did my first PR. And so he has a couple of blog posts on his website. I think, Patrick, you can share this here of like how you like mentally get into this whole event-driven thing and then also start writing your first function. Also, obviously, the VMware Event Broker web page has a couple of examples and readmes to go through. So if you just want to deploy and see how this feels, you can also do that.
Yeah, I mean, to get started, it's really, really easy, and you don't need to really write code to get started, right? And so if you see some of the examples, we try to cover as many examples, some of the ones that we've written and a lot of them from the community, you can deploy it, right? For the Slack function, you don't need to write any code. The only thing you need to do is basically grab the Slack webhook URL that points to your specific Slack channel, plug that in, and you can deploy it. And as you've seen in my demo, you can use the Vsphere UI, so you're not even touching any CLIs or anything like that, right? So you can be a consumer of VEBA and get all the benefits from the community. Once you want to start to customize it, maybe you want to change the functions a little bit, maybe you want to create your own, you can start exploring that. And like I said, there's a series from Patrick, who, when I first met Patrick, he said, hey, no way I can't do any of this stuff. This developer stuff, this sounds too crazy. And now he's writing function authoring flings at VMware. And it really goes to show that, with just a little bit of information, you can really get started and do some really powerful things and really simplify your life. So for IT practitioners, right, if you're thinking about what is next for yourself in a career standpoint, what are the technologies that you should be really thinking about? Event-driven Kubernetes, although we use Kubernetes, you don't need to really know about it, but this is a really great way to learn about, what is this Kubernetes things and what does it actually mean for you as an operator, as an infrastructure admin. I haven't really touched Kubernetes. Several years back, I didn't really jump on that bandwagon, right? It was only until I thought about this particular problem and the challenge and started to want to learn about Kubernetes. And just by being part of this project, I've learned so much more about Kubernetes than if I were to go and read a book or go deploy a Kubernetes cluster. And the benefit of this is that this actually solves real customer problems, right? And so for me, that becomes a really big motivator to try out new technology. And so, like I said, getting started is really easy. You don't need to jump into the code. And as you start to play with these examples, you'll start to pick up the common patterns, and you probably will start to be a contributor of the project as well. So
I think we have one final question from Jan, or is that just a hi? I don't know. Jan, if you want to speak up or put it in chat.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself. And if we don't get to your question, feel free to join the Slack channel. We're there. The VEBA team is all there. And so you can definitely engage with us that way. If we don't have any other questions, really want to thank you for your time. Great participation. And we look forward to seeing hopefully most of you at our upcoming first community meetup.
Nice. Yeah, good feedback in the chat. Thanks, everyone.